Joe, are we good? Okay, wonderful. Well, I just want to start by saying welcome and thank you so much for joining me here at Chef Hangout. I'm really pleased to have you in this class today. Today we're going to learn all about knife skills. I have a great student in this class. We have Jennifer. Jennifer, if you have any questions throughout the class, feel free and type them in the chat box. I'll be checking over periodically. Or if you just unmute your mic, you can do that as well. But we are streaming live, so anybody picking this up, you can feel free and email me afterwards with any questions about the class. Now, just to get started, let me introduce myself. My name is Chef Haylee Otto. I am one of the 24, maybe a little bit more, chefs on chefhangout.com, and I specialize typically in vegetarian and vegan cuisine. Now, I was classically trained, and I've spent quite a bit of time in the kitchen, so today I'm going to teach you one of the most essential skills in the kitchen, and that's knives. Knife skills, how to use a knife, how to pick out a knife, all those good things. So let me give you a rundown of the class. First, we're going to start with knife identification. What knife to use, when to use it. You know, there's so many. It's really, sometimes it gets confusing. So we're going to go over that. Next, we're going to talk about what makes a good knife. What are you looking for when you go shopping? There's, you know, the $13 chef knife and the $130 chef knife. What's the difference and what suits you best? After that, we're going to talk about different types of steel. You know, there's German knives, there's Japanese knives. What's the biggest difference and what you like in your kitchen. Then I'm going to take a sharpening demo with you, and I will show you how to sharpen your knives yourself. Now, there are a lot of different ways and a few different methods. I'm going to talk about those, and then I'll actually sharpen a knife here on camera, and if you've got a whetstone at home, you can sharpen along with me. After that, we are going to practice with our knives. Now, this is the tail end of the course, and we will probably stick around for a little bit longer than the course is supposed to be, and just really get into those veggies and just bear down and figure out how to tackle these vegetables, this produce, and what's the best way and most efficient way to get all of this fruit and vegetable and whatever out of our produce. We get our money's worth, absolutely. So, once again, so glad to have you. It's great. Let's get started. First, for those of you following along with the handout, I will kind of tell you what page we'll be on, and from there you can kind of follow along. We skip around a little bit, but I'll let you know where we are. We're going to start on page 2. What is the right knife for the job? So let's take a look at these knives right here. Let's start out with your basic chef's knife. The chef's knife is going to be one of your most common knives. This is a French knife, chef's knife. You can tell by the elongated blade. You're typically going to find 8-inch, 10-inch, those, you know, 8, 10, 12, those are the most popular. A lot of times in the kitchen you'll see 8 and 10. This has a nice rounded edge, and it is for all-purpose chopping. It's got a great tip for piercing. It's kind of, if you have any knife, it should probably be some form of chef's knife. This is going to be your all-purpose. It has a large blade to handle quite a bit and a nice long blade. Now, you can also find a little bit shorter chef's knife. I like this 6-inch chef's knife because it makes it a little bit easier for me to handle. It's a little bit more agile. But then again, that's my preference. I know a lot of chefs in the kitchen that just really, really love the 8-inch. So, chef's knife, that's going to be your basic. That's where you start. We also have the Santoku knife. That's next down on your list. The Santoku knife, rather than rocking forward with your chef's knife, because we'll talk about this in a bit, it is a sawing motion. With the Santoku knife, you're actually going backward. So, with a chef's knife, you do in a forward motion. You can kind of imagine turning a wheel. With the Santoku knife, you saw backward. The Santoku knife has a much flatter blade. It's a little bit better for produce than your meat and produce combination. This is great if you're doing any butchering or anything like that. this is really, really great for produce. This is one of my favorite knives. We'll get to this in a second as far as the makeup and the different aspects of a knife. You can also get this in a smaller form, and you'll find the Santoka knife is becoming very popular, also known as the Asian chef's knife. Okay, moving on down the line, on your handouts we have the slicing knife or the carving knife. Now this knife is going to have a very thin, elongated blade. This is great to get into in between bones and when you're carving up meat or something like that. The slicing knife is great. Also, you're going to find a boning knife or a fillet knife, very similar. It gets in between, under skin, things like that, and it's very agile, but not so great for chopping. This short or this shallow blade, you know, there's no room for your fingers. You will have a really difficult time trying to chop anything if you use a knife like this. Next up, we are going to take a look at utility blades. Utility blades are going to be a little bit shorter, not quite as long as a carving or slicing knife, but just your general kitchen use if you need to kind of take a slice off something or you know, do small tasks. A utility blade is where it's at. Now, one of my favorite knives in the kitchen is the serrated utility. This sucker will get pineapple or melons or the rind off of anything. This is an amazing knife. I love my serrated utility. I think it's one that you should have in your knife kit or in your knife drawer at all times. This is wonderful. And underneath your utility blade, you're going to have your paring knife. Now, paring knife is a good all-around knife, especially if you're doing any type of garnishing, any type of detail work. I know a lot of people will use it for peeling or carving. This is a great small knife. It's very versatile, and you can really get in and out if you're trying to take the tops off of strawberries or take the eyes out of potatoes. A paring knife is excellent. Next, let's move on to a full-size serrated knife. Full-size serrated you will find really useful if you're doing delicate items. If you see these ridges, they are for those items that you don't want to apply a lot of force. With this, you use a straight back and forward sawing motion. Now, because it has these teeth, you aren't going to need to sharpen your serrated knife. One of the most popular serrated knives, I think, in the kitchen is that stainless steel. Never needs to be sharpened. Goes through a brick and goes through a tin can just as easy as a tomato type of knives. Not quite my favorite. I still like a high-end carbon steel when I have a serrated knife. We'll talk about knife materials in a second. But this is great for delicate items. You don't have to use downward force. You just go back and forth, back and forth. Okay, the next on your list is not a knife, but it is essential to have in your knife kit, and that's a steel or a honing rod. Now, this is to use in between sharpenings and at the end of sharpening. Now, when you sharpen a knife, and we'll go over this later, but when you sharpen a knife, you're kind of tearing up the metal. And what the steel does is it lines that metal back up and it puts it into a point. So a lot of chefs will use this in between really heavy jobs, at the end or in the beginning of every day, just to keep that edge on that knife and keep it really fine. This does not actually sharpen a knife, but it does that nice in-between job. If you have done, you know, a really intense knife or an intense cooking session, cut a lot, you'll want to run your knife over this a couple times. We'll get back to this when we do the sharpening demo. All right, do you have any questions, Jennifer? How's it going? All right, great. Just doing well. So the next thing we'll talk about is what makes a good knife. What are you looking for when you're out purchasing a knife? Well, the first thing you'll see, and this is the biggest part of a knife, is the metal that's used. Now, I had mentioned earlier those serrated knives that never need sharpening, but the serrated knives, or really a lot of the knives that you'll see, especially the really cheap ones, are made from stainless steel. While it's a very durable metal, it is almost impossible for you to sharpen at home. Now, that seems fine because if it's so durable, it doesn't dull. That's not quite the case. Over time, it will start to dull down that edge, and you won't have that nice, pristine, clean edge that you had to begin with. But because the metal is so hard, you won't be able to put that edge back on. So for people that cook every once in a while, don't really use knives, you can kind of get by with a stainless steel knife. But your next step up is a low-carbon steel. Now, that is a steel with carbon mixed in, where carbon keeps a nice edge. It's also much easier for you to sharpen on a stone. It will grind up a little bit more. You do want to hand wash these knives once you have carbon, and you want to fully dry it off. You don't want any water spots on your knife. From there, we're going to have a high carbon steel, and that's when you get into the really expensive knives, the ones that are a little bit higher up in price. You're going to have a high carbon steel. Once again, keeps a great edge, a lot easier to sharpen, but you do want to take very good care of them. Don't put them in the dishwasher. It's a little bit too hot in there, and it will it'll adjust the strength of your metal. Not quite good for the metal of your knives. So you want to hand wash them, hand dry them, and take good care of them. Now, the next one, and these have become quite popular, I don't actually have one, is a ceramic knife. Now, ceramic knives have become popular because they will keep a pristine edge. The edge is great on a ceramic knife. The reason I don't have one is because I am very clumsy, and I drop everything. And ceramic knives are fragile. They can be expensive, but they can also be just quite fragile. And while you never want to drop your knives in the first place, you especially don't want to drop a knife that can shatter. So ceramic knives are great. I just don't trust myself with one. So I guess that's up to you as the user whether or not you think you can keep those without cracking them. I just don't trust myself because I'm a butterfingers. So we've talked about the blade. I would go, if you're just kind of getting into it, you still look for a carbon steel, but maybe not a high carbon steel. You can kind of find one in that mid-range for knives. With the next aspect you want to look at, we're going to talk about the handle. Now, the handle of the knife, you can find a few different things. A lot of times you will find a composite that is either plastic or stone. Sometimes I've got one here. It's got a metal or a rubber handle on it. Some you will find like this, the cleaver, like my global, with it's just one solid forged piece. And with some, this is a specialty knife, you'll find stone. This has a stone inlay with wood. Whatever it is, you want to make sure and take care of it. If it has creases or if it has any type of space in between, you want to make sure you dry it out thoroughly. You don't want any bacteria in the spaces. If it has wood on the handle, once again, you don't want to leave it in water. You don't want to leave it wet. You want to make sure you take care of that handle. Now, on all really nice knives, or all at least mid-grade nice knives, you're going to see this thing right here called a bolster. A bolster is there to balance the weight of your knife. You want your bolster you want your knife to be well balanced, so it's not too heavy on the back, it's not too heavy on the front. It's got a nice, even balance in the middle there. As you sharpen your knives, if you've got a knife for years and years and years, and I know a lot of chefs have reached this point, your knife will start to kind of change shape, and that will also, as you're taking the metal off, that will also make the knife a little bit less balanced, and that's where you really need to start kind of stepping up and getting another knife once it starts to get off balance. If you're just kind of beginning out, then you don't have to worry about this as much, but just know that that's what that's for. That strip in the middle, right there and right here, they're going to have a nice even balance from the handle to the blade. Now, another aspect that you'll want to look for is a full tang blade. That means that this blade goes all the way from the tip to the heel of the handle. It's one solid piece. I'm sure more than one of you out there have seen a knife or we're using a knife where the handle actually came out, and the blade came out of the handle. This one is one that I think was bought at a department store, and you can tell, and especially because you can't see it all the way through. That's a good hint. If you don't see it, a lot of times it's not a full tang. This is probably just an insert, and if it's got enough wear and tear, it'll pop right out. And with that, you might have to watch your fingers, because that's definitely a danger issue. Okay, so we have our blade, our handle, and the tang, and then the bolster. Those are going to be the main components of your knife. And then we'll look at the back of the knife. On a lot of chef's knives, especially French knives, you've got a nice thick back of this knife. And this is great for if you're doing any cracking, or if you have something that needs a little bit more weight, a little bit more force. A lot of chefs will use this back edge right here. Be careful because your blade is exposed, but that's one thing that this is commonly used for. And then we have the tip. You always want to protect the tip of your knife, but this is great for piercing, or really getting into the produce of the meat or whatever you're cooking. Okay, let's talk about German versus Japanese. Now I'm just going to do a very brief kind of overview of the differences here. With German, typically you are going to find a little bit heavier knives. A lot of the great German brands have a little bit more weight in their knife. Now this is not necessarily a bad thing. I typically prefer German knives. I just like the feel of them. That's what they gave us when we went to culinary school, and so that's just one thing that kind of feels like home for me. Not too heavy, well weighted, but one of the most popular in German is Wüsthof. That's one of the top brands. It typically just feels a little bit weightier. I like the feel of it. Now, if you feel like that's just a little bit too much, you want something a bit lighter, you can often find that many of the Japanese brands do have a little bit lighter system. Get my global. I know Globals are very popular. Shun and Mac are very popular Japanese brands, and they do tend to be a little bit lighter weight. The Japanese knives tend to be a little bit harder to sharpen, but they keep that edge longer. So you have to be a little bit more, I guess, patient when sharpening a Japanese knife, because it's going to take a different skill and a little bit more time than a German knife, because German knives tend to be a little bit softer. You'll have to sharpen them a little bit more frequently than Japanese steel. But both are great. It's a learning curve, and you kind of get one and see which one you like. It also depends on what you're doing. For the Global, for the serrated utility, I love it because it's lightweight, and I typically am doing work where I'm moving around a lot rather than chopping. Okay, so let's take a look at how to hold a knife. We've talked about the blade and the bolster and everything, but let's look at how you're going to wrap your fingers around that knife. Now this is going to be, for those of you following along, on page 6. You take a look at page 6. Now for this, I am going to switch cameras, and we're going to get an up-close picture. There we go. Okay, so basic chef's knife. And we will start with some celery. And at first, if you want to just kind of watch a little bit, we can do that. And then if you want to chop along with me, you're more than welcome. But we want to start with our finger and our thumb on the blade. We want to be holding the blade. And then we wrap the rest of our fingers around that handle, and it's almost kind of cradled. Not really getting a grip on it. I'm letting this finger and my thumb be the guide, and then I'm cradling that handle with the rest of my hand. A lot of chefs, or a lot of people in the kitchen, will have a tendency, they try and put their finger on top. One thing that does is the force, the pressure point that you have right there, is going to throw the weight of your knife off. It's going to create an unbalanced aspect with your knife. So you always want to make sure and tuck that finger down in there. When I'm teaching cooking classes in a classroom, I always have students that'll have up there, and there's always, we go by and they always check each other. Put your finger down, put your finger down. So that's one thing. It's a hard habit to break, and you know, plenty of people will find themselves doing that in the beginning. But if you just hold your finger and thumb right there, you'll have much more control over your blade. Another thing is a callus. Some people will find that they get a little bit of a callus on their finger right there, and that's normal. It's just something that if you cook enough, you will kind of build up a little bit of a spot right there, and after a day or two, it won't hurt. You know, at first it's not quite comfortable, but you really get into it. So the next part is rocking. When you're cutting with a chef's knife, you're going to rock. You don't want to do as much up and down. You want to rock with it. It's almost like a wave motion. Think of it kind of as a piston almost, just going down and up. With the chef's knife, we go a forward sawing motion. Yeah, let's slow it a little bit harder. Forward sawing. And then when we pick up, we're bringing back. When possible, it's so much easier to keep the tip of your knife on the board. And that just gives you a nice fluid movement. Now, the other thing you want to do is watch your fingers. You want to have the hand that holds your produce or whatever it is you're chopping, you want to have those fingers tucked under, and you kind of creep back. Now, you can use your fingers as a guide and have them kind of flat, or if you're not quite as comfortable with that, you can have them scoot back a little bit, but you always want to make sure that you don't have them sticking out, you don't have your thumb out there. You want to create a nice tucked in claw. How does that feel, Jennifer? You can give me a thumbs up if you want. Excellent, excellent. All right, now that we've got our knife handling, we're not going to get into the different cuts yet, but now that we've got our knife handled and we know the different parts and how to hold a knife safely and how to hold our produce, let's take a look at sharpening. Now this is called a whetstone. This information, if in your handouts, is going to be on page 4 and 5. Now, on page 4, we talk about the different ways to sharpen your knife. I'm going to move back up. Now, there are, I guess, 3 different ways to sharpen a knife. The first way is to use an electric sharpener. Electric sharpeners scare me, as they scare most chefs, because with the stone going so quickly, if you are not skilled and you don't know exactly the angle that you're supposed to use and all those different things that go into it, you can damage a little bit the shape of your knife. Take a little bit too much here and a little bit too much there. Electric sharpeners are they often just shave off too much of your knife, and it really does shorten the life that you will have this blade, or shorten the length of time that you'll have this blade. So I always warn against electric sharpeners. It's a little bit too much at one time to really take that on. You can also take it to a professional, which is great. Professionals know exactly what they're doing. This can get a little bit costly. If you don't want to spend that much every time, you also want to take it to one that you trust. You know, knives become your babies. They're like your pets. So you want to take it to somebody that you know will do kitchen knives really well. The problem with that is they also use a rolling stone. They use a method which does shave off a little bit more than you would if you were using a whetstone. So the cost factor, the time factor of driving it out there and picking it up, if you're like me, I won't do that very often because I always forget or anything like that. So you can take it to a professional. That is an option. But if you know how, the best way to go is to use a whetstone. Now, whetstone is spelled W-H-E-T-S-T-O-N-E, whetstone, and wet meaning to sharpen or sharp, not W-E-T. There are some stones that people use that are water stones, but typically a whetstone does not need to be oiled or watered. That oil or that water can kind of trap in loose metal particles and can tear up your knife a little bit more than you were intending. Some people still love to use oil, and that's fine if that's your preference, but plenty of whetstones are fine used dry. Now I have a medium and a fine grit on this whetstone. If you've got 1, 2, or 3, you always want to start with the more coarse grit. But this one is a medium fine, so we will start. And Jennifer, you can switch over to the page, I believe, the next page, page 5. And we can take a look at your sharpening with a whetstone. Did you have a whetstone today, or were you just going to watch the demo and do it later? Excellent, excellent. That's a tri-stone. That's wonderful. You can find, oh, wait, no, it's not, it's flat. You can often find, if you don't know where to get a whetstone, you can find them in hunting stores sometimes. That's a really great place to look, or kitchen stores. You don't typically find them in your super centers or markets or anything like that. Asian markets actually carry them very frequently. So here's different spots, and always you can get it on Amazon. You can get nearly anything on Amazon these days. But so you want it down. Now I typically like to have a towel underneath so that it doesn't slip and slide. And we're going to switch back so I can give you a close-up view. All right. So we have our knife, we have our whetstone. Now, a knife blade you'll want to sharpen typically anywhere between 20 and 10. It really depends on how sharp you want that edge and how long it's going to keep. I find at about 14 degrees or so. A lot of people will practice by stacking pennies under the back of their knife until they get kind of that angle that they want, and it shows them really exactly what angle they're doing. But to get, say, that 14-degree angle, if you're not quite sure where that is, you can start with a 90 and then do about half of that. It's going to be about 45. Another half of that. That's going to be about 27 or so. And then just another half of that just gets smaller and smaller. That's where you're going to hit about 14. You've got a little bit of leeway, but as long as you keep kind of even pressure, you should be fine. So since I have you on this side, I'll start this way. In my handouts, you can kind of see what the top of my hand is doing. So I will, just to not block this side, I'm going to kind of use this hand. But you want to do even pressure across the blade. And my visualization is, what I always thought is, it's almost like I'm taking a very thin slice off the top of this using my whole blade. So even pressure. You don't want to change the angle of your blade all the way to the tip. So bring it back as you bring it across. I'm going to do that about 5 times. A little bit short. There we go. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Now, one thing that you want to be certain of, you don't want to go, with these anyway, with the softer knives, you don't want to go in dual directions. Just like if you're filing your nails, you always want to go in one direction across the nail. You don't want to give it a sawing motion back and forth. So even strokes, making sure not to turn at the tip or anything like that. And 5. Okay, now I'm going to turn over to my fine grit. Now this is going to have a higher number. The higher number on your grit, the finer the grit it is. We're going to do the same thing, same direction. Four, 5. I'm going to switch. One thing I love about this process is it really puts you in touch, and switch hands so you can see, it really puts you in touch with the knife itself. When you have good knives, you are going to be spending a little bit more right out the box, or, right out. But the great thing is that you are going to enjoy your knife more. It's going to be much better to cut with, to cook with. You're not going to fight with it. And it's something that will just improve your cooking experience. You'll also save some money on Band-Aids in the long run. Now after we do our sharpening, 5 on each side. Did you get 5 on each side? You had 2 different grits, correct? Excellent, excellent. We had 5 on each side. After that, we're going to move over to a steel. Now, a steel, like I said, sometimes it's flat, also known as a honing rod. A lot of times you will find this, it comes in your knife set. Very often comes in your knife set. If not, you can find it at a restaurant supply store, a kitchen supply store, or, what do I say, Amazon, that works, or any specialty online store. But local business should have them if you want to support local business. So, you're going to do a very similar method that you did with the whetstone. You want to keep it at that same angle, and you just want to do 5 or 6 on each side. Now, some people will go out. Some people, rather than having 2 hands, will like to go down. Let me get this close up. Here. So we have back to front, same angle both ways. And a lot of people, I usually have a lot of students that will kind of turn. You definitely don't want to, turn it. You want to keep it at that nice shallow angle that you sharpened it at. And so, after that, you have a nice, sharp blade. You can do this, you want to do this, I would say every couple of days. If you're in a moderate kitchen, and if you're in a commercial kitchen, you're probably going to use it every day and even in between different jobs. If you're in a regular kitchen, just use it every time you cook, every couple of days. But just a few runs across the steel. And after this, you want to wash off your blade because you will have some particles, some metal particles left on. And then a nice soap. And a nice towel, dry, a nice clean towel. Set this aside. Okay, before we start practicing with vegetables, because like I said, I usually save that to the end so we can carry over into the after class. Before we start practicing with vegetables, I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about